Oh, hi, everybody. Thanks for joining today. We're going to start by briefly welcoming to the Center for Design. My name is Estefania Ciliotta. I'm the Associate Director here at the Center. And we have also Paolo on the call, our Director and Founding Director. And we have a wonderful panel today. So as some of you may know, the Center for Design hosts these moments that we call conversation series to talk and discuss with the audience and the community about many different topics. This is a compilation of the topics that we've been discussing from the beginning since the center was founded in 2019, 2020. And more recently, we've been having discussions around design and law, co-design, body and embodiment, for example, data visualization and AI, social impact and civic design. The previous conversation was about disability in the design futures. And today we have an amazing panel led by our moderator, by Nathan, and we have Marcus Carney, Jen Briselli, Greg Dalle-Molle, and Michael Arnold, who are going to be introducing this and discussing about perception and modeling for healthcare design. And I'll leave the floor now to Nathan to introduce this amazing discussion and panel. So Nathan, welcome and thank you.
Thank you, Estefania. I wanted to call this conversation a shorter title, which is, do you see what I see? And basically, I feel this is sort of the heart of the matter in many of the things we're investigating today. Maybe another way to put it is, how do we arrive at a shared vision of anything amongst ourselves? And I want to point out as well that we made the topic healthcare in particular, because our case that we're looking at with Jen is about healthcare, and it's looking at design, especially with regard to invisible systems and what designers are doing who must invoke systemic approaches to design because they're grappling with systems. This system we're looking at, looked at in our workshop, is maybe one of the largest, most complex, and maybe most intractable systems in the world, the healthcare system, or I would say the healthcare and sometimes lack of system in the US. So I'll give you a little anecdote of what it's like to look at a system from inside. About 40 years ago, and I've been working with healthcare applications as a designer for almost that long. One of the projects I was working on was to install infrastructure, fiber optic infrastructure into the healthcare campuses here in Boston, the 4 major centers. We took it on ourselves to put in experimental systems for high-speed image sharing in cardiology, radiology, neonatal, and so forth and so on. And did a lot of the early experimentation of what broadband networks might be in that particular domain. 10 years after that work, I found myself, after my heart stopped a few times for about 12 seconds, I found myself on a gurney in an operating room where they put the last piece of fiber optic in. They put an optical fiber up my leg into my heart to look inside my heart. So I was actually living inside the system of infrastructure that we had installed earlier to do exactly that, share very complex medical data across networks. So I have an insider's view of that particular system, that part of the system of healthcare. And I think that's an important point in what we're talking about today is how do we get inside systems to understand and study them? Because misunderstanding is kind of the heart of the matter for design as a process. We start with misunderstandings, we create misunderstandings. And so misunderstanding as it inhabits the design process, in particular exists between designer and client. And this is something that designers deal with in different ways. And as a part of that conversation between designer and client, there are various ways to represent what we're talking about, what we think we're talking about, or things we don't know we're talking about yet. And so I put on the screen just as a reference to what some of those tools are that we design to use within the process of designing. And so this is a schematic of a system, which is for monitoring, for doing triage on symptoms and side effects for chronic care of cancer patients, which was developed as part of our design consultancy that Professor Tirado, otherwise known as Kate around here, and I worked on, and part of which was worked on by Professor Millard. So in this schematic here, you can see something that's of great importance, which is in the center, you see a distinction between a person, a patient, and a body. And that may seem obvious to people, but in the course of working with complex systems, we often don't make enough distinctions to know exactly what we're talking about and what the proper relationships are between those elements of the system. So I just throw that up as a schematic to remind people we're not designing, as Richard Buchanan would say, toasters and posters here. We're designing things that are invisible to us about things that are invisible, like the health of a person is kind of an invisible thing. And with that, I introduce you to this, our next conversant, Marcus Carney, who I'm grateful to Paul Payne-Garrow for, from the American Society of Cybernetics, for making the introduction of myself to Marcus. And will always say I can thank him. I have great gratitude for the conversations, long, dense conversations we've had over the last couple of years to figure out what this is, meaning this thing that you've been working with. And so I'll hand it to you to say, to answer this question for us as best you can in the limited time we have, because it's very complex. What is this systemic structural modeling and what is it not?
Thank you, Nathan. Thank you all. It's a great privilege to be here. I'll turn a little bit towards the camera because everyone else can see themselves. So in the literature, you will find systemic structural constellations. And I intentfully use constellations here right away because this is how the method is known. It's a group modeling methodology, which in its current form was conceived by the founders of the SYST Institute. SYST is the short form for this methodology, which we in shorthand call structural constellations, as opposed to systemic constellations, which you will also find in the literature, and family constellations, which we will also find, and maybe a bunch of other different forms. The founders, Matthias Varga from Kibet and Inza Spara, they have been working with this and developing this and discovering this since the early 1980s, when as of the late 70s, they started to experiment and learn group modeling in various forms, which go way back to a person, famous man named Jacob Moreno, who was the inventor of psychodrama about 100 years ago, who used creative forms, dramatic forms to improve his patients' lives, histories. And to say it very quickly, in the course of 100 years, all the drama was taken out of this process, and this is how we can use it in such a I shouldn't say detached way. It's not detached at all. It's just controlled, safe. It's calm. We know where we are. We know where we are at every moment of the process. And when we don't know, we try to figure it out through certain techniques. But these are the names which should be mentioned historically. So there was Jacob Moreno, and then Virginia Satir was a family therapist who did family sculpting and parts party and what have you, other techniques she employed, also still quite dramatic and also playful. And then other people like Ruth McClendon and Les Cadiz on the West Coast, already influenced by the developments of the Institute of Palo Alto and the Cybernetics movement, which we won't have time here, but I'm just throwing out all these references so you can Google them. They developed forms of constellating. In Germany, it was Thea Schönfelder, and the most famous but also notorious name people may know is Bert Hellinger, which to say something positive right away about Hellinger, which is maybe unusual for someone like me, because there have been a lot of discontent about 20 years ago. There were literally mostly in Germany between the generations, also almost the constellations wars going on, and in the pupil and the student era generations, this has not completely vanished. But to actually say something positive about Hellinger is that he one of the things he discovered was within family work was that there is a certain generational order, and if that order, systemic order, is sometimes it gets out of order, which means that responsibilities may be taken by younger generations for parent members, for parent parts, or for all the siblings, and then the whole system gets a little bit challenged. And he found out that it's useful to bring that back into an order, to see who was born first and who was born second, who is responsible for so and so, and that the parents always come before, just simply chronologically, come before the children and so on. Just that is already turned out very helpful. So to say this, and then of course there's this whole, you can go into the Hellinger history, which is extremely problematic. So this is not family constellating, this is not systemic constellating. I forgot the school of Heidelberg, which was instrumental to introduce second order cybernetics, people like Heinz von Förster and George Spencer Brown, Gunther Weber, Fritz Simon. I'm forgetting now, please forgive me, whoever is listening from that. There are several others who were very influential, and they came up around the same time at Matthias and Inser in the 80s, and so there are close relations there, and respect, which is very important, of course, for the developments and discoveries. The major discovery of Matthias Varga and Inser Sparrow was to acknowledge that whatever you constellate, whatever the model is only the client modeler's model. No one else has direct access to that model. That was the major contribution. And I say this was the major contribution by my teachers, but they would say, well, this is Wittgenstein. And so it is. So I'm just referencing Wittgenstein, the Tractatus, as something to go back to look at Proposition 2.0. It's this very famous so-called picture theory of language. I already mentioned language here because that's the hidden gem and the hidden threat for designers, for therapists, for whoever you have. Language is, we were kidding about the AI here, picking up what we speak and maybe focusing in this very wide shot, and then maybe not. And so I tried to address the AI in there already directly, it didn't react. But this is basically what we've been having forever with language. And in AI, of course, with large language models, this is the challenge. So the challenge of language never goes away. Before I say a little bit more about language, I will just mention that the SÜST founders would also emphasize that constellating itself, modeling with person representors in the workspace, is only part of an embedding into a solution-focused process. And they found, so the SÜST founders found the founders of the solution-focused process, who were Steve Deschaes and Inso Kim Berg. In the literature, you will find the name the School of Milwaukee, the Brief Therapy School of Milwaukee. And again, the basis for that was Wittgenstein. Because a little later in the Tractatus, towards the end, Wittgenstein introduces the notion that problem and solution are not related at all. I'll just let that sit here. We cannot go. That's another very long conversation, which has been going on for 100 years. But this is the core of the solution-focused approach. and it makes a whole lot of sense. So the solution-focused folks and Wittgenstein will tell you, you will not find the solution in the problem. Which brings us to techniques which are used in solution-focused process. By now, it's in organizational consulting used more than in therapy, or equally, I would say. And it is querying forms of querying, which is called the solution-focused interview, which precedes a systemic structural constellation, with which we try to get the client into an abductive form of reasoning. So we would ask, not question, what is your goal? Which is possible, it's valid. With some forms of problem, if the issue is to not being able to reach a goal, well, then you literally work with a goal. But we also work with this query where we would rather say questions like, how would you recognize that the desired step in the right direction or in the desired direction has happened? Or even more severe, the famous miracle question, Google it, which is, imagine that a miracle has happened, everything you desired has changed, but you didn't recognize it at first. How would you recognize it? What would have changed? So this is a very, I muddled it up here, forgive me. So you would do that in a more hypnosystemic way, in a more, concentrated form. So these are the, and why do we ask questions like that? To get out resources. This is resourceful work. This is resource, and resources can also be constellated. So what can be constellated are not only person representors, and Nathan introduced the neologism representor, because a representative, we found, is someone who knows what she represents, who or what she represents, and politically representative, etc. In SYST, the other great discovery, other than that the model is only the client modelers, was that the representors don't have to know who or what they represent. And the central phenomenon which we utilize in this work, which is called representational perception, and we've gone into this in the past days a lot, and many of the people present have experienced it, that still works, that emerges even if representors do not know who or what they represent. So we had the luxury of working simultaneously with person representors, and several are at this table. And when we work one-on-one with clients, we work sequentially. So we would have chairs. Chairs are pretty good ideal, other than person representors, placeholders, because then the client can step into each position and step out again and experience. But it takes a little longer. It's much more luxurious and to work simultaneously with representors. And it's more lively and more fun and all of that also. I mentioned the hypnosystemic approach. And this would be another pillar of the SYST methodology, which goes back to Milton Erickson, the inventor of hypnotherapy. And it's basically a dedicated, this is mostly about listening and being very precise about language use, another connection to Wittgenstein, language use, and paying attention to the actual phraseology of the client, because there's a lot of information in there. The actual phraseology, so not reframing it prematurely, never reframing it, trying to understand what is meant by certain phraseology. Very, very important. Right. So I mentioned information. We work in this with an Batesonian information concept, which is in Bateson cybernetic terms very famous. Information he defined as a difference that makes a difference at some later event. This already can sit here, and then the SYST form would be a definition of information, a difference that may make a difference at some later event. So we have the possibility of doing testing, of almost doing sometimes a form of rehearsal of action, of pragmatics, yeah. And so this is the information term. when mentioning language and the crux of language, the difficulty of dealing with language, we have to also acknowledge the name Alfred Korzybski. And you may not recognize the name, but you may recognize one of the most famous quotes in the 20th century, which is "The map is not the territory." This was coined by Alfred Korzybski. And he had good reason for that, because as in psychology, it is important with certain dispositions, with certain pathologies, it's very important to distinguish between the map and the territory. But in epistemological terms, it's just one of the possibilities we use and apply, and it's very useful still. Then came along second-order cybernetics, and the good Heinz von Förster, the director of the biological computer lab at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, back in the, he was the director of that institute, which was the foundational research institute in cybernetics in the 50s and 60s, and later in the 70s, he went to conferences and he would say, "The map is the territory," and confuse everyone. Because it was Heinz's notion and this whole movement after the first-order cybernetics era to introduce second-order cybernetics with the knowledge or insight that we're always part, or in so many problem settings, we're part of the inside. We're in the inside. We're not outside observers. We are not external, top-down, external observers. We are part of the game. So Heinz would say maps is the only thing we have. All we have is maps. And interestingly enough, this is in full accordance to very modern, very recent developments in foundational research. If you look at Donald Hoffman, the research at Irvine, and if you look at the active inference research, this is there's a very strong notion of Carl Friston's concept. I will mention that at the end. So it looks, at the moment, it looks maps is literally all we have, and we're trying to relate maps. So in terms of SUS, and I think, I'm not sure if someone else in my school or in my milieu came up with this, so I may have come up with this, but I'm not sure. The point is that in SUS, what we do is we deal with map territory as the map becomes the territory, and this is the way I like to explain it. So we through the solution focus process, we establish a first picture. I mean, the client does the elements of a first picture. That would be some sort of a map, but then this works, the client works towards what is called in the literature a solution picture. But that's also sometimes a preliminary solution picture, as you, Jen, our client, may attest to. And so this notion is the third idea here, to say the map becomes the territory and then is re-implemented. Again, so to speak. And this may take a while. Sometimes it's a fulguration, sometimes it's a longer process. If you work with teams, it may take a few steps, etc. I think I'm almost done also with my time. Right, and maybe a little later I can address if you want to try this at home, what to pay attention.
Thank you, Marcus. So we'll move to Jen, who brought the case here. Jen works with major players in the healthcare system, very high level, an abstract level, and does that work on the basis of a fascinating career, moving from, well, zigzagging her way into the design practice at the highest level with a firm that now is grappling with one of our biggest problems.
Yeah, and I know there's probably a lot of interest. I'm totally going to do the awkward thing too. I'm like, do I talk this way? Do I talk that way? So just sorry. I think there's probably a lot of interest in hearing like what this actually looked like when we did it on Wednesday. And also to hear from my experience playing, well, not playing, in the role of the client, the constellator. But I should preface all of that with the fact that I am a designer and a strategist. So it was a bit meta and even strange for me, you know, having had plenty of conversations with Nathan and then with Marcus, hearing about and learning about this approach, and then then participating in the pre-process interviews where Marcus talked to me, asked me questions as he was describing, but then also I'm thinking about it not just as the client who is being sort of prepared and brought into this process, but also as a designer. You know, I had three little like meta personalities thinking, well, what would I be doing if I was Marcus now? So, you know, so this is all a bit muddled in that way, but ultimately, I thought that, you know, to participate in this process as the constellator and the modeler, the territory, the domain that was most of interest here, healthcare, wasn't just the healthcare system, but in my case, very particularly focused on the very interesting tensions within health insurance around the way that health insurance plans and the delivery of care, and in this case, insurers call themselves payers, which like, we won't even get into that, right? And think about that for a second. If your entire identity in the system is to be a payer, okay. But there is with this comes along an intention to both measure and then also to create targets. And so for those who are not aware, and even for those who are, the reminder, the most kind of salient point here is that health insurance, particularly types of insurance that meet different needs for different populations, which again, I will gloss over here, are held to different standards and expectations. And so there are regulatory bodies here in the States, so we'll just abbreviate that as government, creates things that are both measurement tools to assess the current state, quality, et cetera, of health insurance plans in terms of how they deliver health experiences and outcomes. Side note, I will pause to emphasize experiences and outcomes, not the same thing. And then at the same time, not just taking a measurement as sort of a barometer or a temperature check, also creating targets. Many of you probably know Goodhart's law, right? As soon as a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. Like, so there's a very strong tension there. I would call that the central dilemma. And that is what Marcus and I talked through when I said, for me as the constellator, the domain, the map here, I'm very interested to explore that tension because that is a place where I'm doing a lot of work with my clients right now. But in order to participate in this process, I eventually had to, with some, you know, I won't say struggle, but it wasn't easy for me as a designer to get out of the designerly space and just allow myself to be almost a channel through which the system decided to then manifest in the room. So the activity itself, for those who weren't there, gosh, I wish we could just share like a fast video of the whole 3 hours or whatever it was, you know, just download it into your brain. But it largely looked like me as constellator selecting the key aspects or entities that are in this domain. That's the word I like to use here. I don't love it, but for me, it makes sense to not mix it up with other terms like the constellation itself. For me, the conceptual domain, I selected a number of entities. And again, I think one key is that it's not just human or organic entities or community or, you know, whatever altitude you want to think, individual, group, team, society, et cetera. It also included the concepts of measurement, the concept of a target, the concept of innovative protective spaces, which was another one that was important for me in this. So we got into this process knowing that we would be placing entities into this constellation that included humans, like patients, but also things like bodies, like measurement, like targets. And so Marcus expertly facilitated this process where he basically gave me instructions and said, now, Jen, as the constellator, you will take a volunteer, and we'll come back to that in a second, and somebody in the room who is going to be a representative volunteered to represent a particular entity that I have assigned them, and I would place them physically into the place in the room that represents what I think so far is right. I will call out, it was very interesting for me as an individual, as a person who thinks in systems. I'm very used to both creating maps and thinking about ecosystems and value flows. I live and see these, and like things like that in my head are just there all day long. And so for me, I'm naturally attuned to that, and it's a very cerebral process. So, you know, I keep joking with Marcus, I'm just giving him a hard time, but one of the very first things he said to me when I was placing the first person into their position, I think I was standing there kind of being like, okay, where did she go? What makes sense? And he was like, quit thinking about it and just do it. And I was like, that is so key, because even for those of us who are used to intellectualizing this process, the hardest part might be remembering this is about embodied cognition and perception, not just on the part of the representers who will be entities in the system to see what they see, but for me, constellating the system, get out of the head, allow myself to access what is tacit, what is embodied, and not let the tyranny of the explicit force me to bring it out up into the open, because if I do that, I won't get the full picture. So I went about going ahead and taking volunteers one by one who would be representers in this system, this constellation, placing them where I thought they just felt right, deciding where someone went in the room, deciding which way they were facing. Over the course of doing that, I found it easier and easier to quit thinking about it and just physically place. But I will say the first few, I was a little like, ooh, what is happening? And then once people were placed, and we did this in layers so that we didn't have to, place like 15 people and then do it all in one. We basically paused to then ask, what did those representers see? What were they sensing? What were they seeing? And I will try to be kind of short with the rest of this, and then you guys can ask questions and we can enrich from there. But what was so compelling to me after it was all said and done, I had expectations. I was already familiar and aware of this process and kind of what the goals maybe might be overall. But I was most struck by having, especially in this case, someone who represented me, right? We call that the focus in this particular exercise. And actually it was Anne who became the representer of me. And listening to her say things, even the very first couple sentences where, we had only placed a few of these human representers. And by the way, I should reinforce for those who missed this, we did this in a way where the actual specifics were not very clear. It was sort of semi-disclosed, and that means that I didn't tell the representers really what they represented. Doesn't matter, they don't need it. I used some abbreviations for my own mental process because, those you can see, these are the abbreviations we use. Things like P for patient, B for body. They were more for me and for Marcus to be able to reference and say, hey, P, what are you seeing? That's a way for the representer to remember that they just represent an entity. But you'll notice if you're P in this constellation, and I didn't tell you ahead of time that stands for patient, you wouldn't necessarily know. Were you P or B?
I was B.
You were B, okay.
Yeah.
So like basically you don't know, but when you are asked, what do you see? It kind of frees you up from worrying about how do I represent a patient? How do I play the role of a patient? How do I feel empathy for the patient? Like forget all that. It's not about that. It's about truly, what do you see? What are you sensing? What is available to you in the embodied moment that you're in? And so hearing Anne talk about things that she was seeing by virtue of where she was situated in the room was almost unnerving, okay? And those who were there yesterday frequently throughout the day saw me make faces when representers would say things. Sometimes I was like, sometimes I would laugh because there were like these kind of components of the process that were not at all visible or available to the representers, but the things that they were perceiving were connecting dots and giving me new eyes for this system that I work in all day long and every day, have still not yet seen. So sort of at the conclusion of all of this, I will say, I was thinking about how to describe what I experienced, because it's very clear to me, the value, and Marcus said this, right? This is my model. This is the constellator's model. This is not a model that I'm going to go now articulate. It doesn't point me to like, here are 12 strategic recommendations I'm going to take my clients on forward with. But it did, as I say, connect dots for me. There were components of this process that revealed to me that I've been making assumptions, or that my own instincts in engaging within as part of this system, as part of the structure, there are things that were not visible to me that are now, and that might then change my own behavior and choices going forward. The value is really for the constellator more than anything. And it occurs to me that both, Marcus and I, you could call us both practitioners, but our roles were very different in this process. He facilitating and me constellating. And so it raises questions, and I know we'll talk about this shortly, how this might fold into one's craft, because I'm already thinking to myself, how might I explore this and try it at home myself? I'm not just thinking about how do I, designer Jen, take my clients through a process like this. I'm not even actually worried about that right now. I'm thinking, how do I, Jen, get the opportunity to constellate more things? And what do I need to do to establish an infrastructure where that can happen with some regularity, even if it's always an internal process that my clients never see, The only other thing I will say is that at the end of all this, when I got home Wednesday night, and I was tired. This is a cognitively taxing exercise. Even for the representers who may not know at all what they represent, they're just told, stand here and tell me what you see. And some of them are like, I feel really uncomfortable because there's another person right near me. That's weird. That's like might be all it is. That's cognitively taxing, So I was tired, and my husband was asking me like, well, what the hell did you do? And I was like, you know what? I feel like what happened was that my mind, and I'm using mind here, not brain, my mind was kind of pulled out of the central location that you might imagine it is, and truly spread out in front of me. And in like such a strange meta second order way, I was, like, for example, listening to what Anne was describing, I'm like, I felt like I was having one of those weird out of body experiences, watching myself react to the system that I was inside of. So it was like someone pulled my guts out of me, laid them in front of me to look at, and then at the end of the day, like tucked it back into me. And I know this sounds so crazy and esoteric, and I swear to you, I don't think in these terms all day long every day. I have to talk to clients who would not understand a word that's been spoken here today. But like, I can come away from this process thinking to myself, all right, when Anne said this, that tells me there's something for me to push on there in my work. And oh, when Nathan was walking the room representing this other thing, it tells me, wow, he went and paid attention to something that nobody else in that constellation is paying attention to. That's actually happening in the real world too. I didn't see that before, but maybe I should go knocking on that door. So somebody asked me before we started, what about the process illuminated those things? I have no idea. And I think that's the both the pro and the con, the beauty and the danger of this is that it's embodied, it's tacit. The insights come through in that embodied tacit way. For me to try to bring them out into the open or the explicit flattens or even dissolves the four-dimensional nature of this thing. So I hope I don't sound like too much of a crazy person, but that is what I experienced as the constellator. And now as a designer reflecting on how this might meld into our practice, I think there's a lot of very interesting things to talk about. So I will stop there. I am happy to go through any more, I know there may be questions about details and some of you are probably chomping at the bit to know more about like what the entities were. We also involved a tetralemma framework, but I won't get into that yet because we can see where that makes sense to talk about. But I'll stop there.
Thank you, Jen.
Yep.
And I want to point out that Jen's firm is called Topology. We'll get back to that too, unless that rings a bell with you. We can talk further about that. Thank you. So my other sort of blunt questions about this are in order is to Michael is with whom Marcus worked with some students who may or may not be here today. Yesterday. Could this be taught? Could this be incorporated into design education? And what did you learn about this that might illuminate that for us who work in the education of designers?
This was a good question and one I was not expecting.
That's a sign of a good question.
That's for a moment. I think, my mind immediately jumps to like some of the challenges to do this in a classroom situation. One of the things that interested me about both Marcus and Jen's description is how much like references to time came up in this. And I think, I think that is a bit of a challenge for the classroom because you're very time pressed when you have a group of students and you're trying to introduce a set of concepts. So I wonder if there's, and because of the kind of unevenness inherent in the method itself, where the constellators are really the source of knowledge, is the one having the reflective experiences, is the one almost, we were talking a little bit before about almost using the people in a very kind of unbalanced way.
Asymmetrical.
In an asymmetrical.
Yeah, actually, if you don't mind,
asymmetrical
I'll say
way.
very fast, that was a place that was even some discomfort for me as the constellator, because I became keenly hyper aware that when somebody would do or say something that would give me a little bit of an illumination and I would have a chuckle or I would go, ooh, all the representatives in the room were like, oh my God, Jen just reacted, what's going on? And it became aware that I almost felt like there was a discomfort in the fact that the representatives really are being utilized as entities. They're little sensing robots, really, which is an oversimplification. I think Marcus would probably disagree with that, right? You're not just there to be a sensing robot, but that was for the constellator somewhat uncomfortable. And I think it would beg the question, if you were to involve different design students in this process as representatives, are they getting that experience that a constellator needs to have to understand it? So yes, I cannot emphasize enough how keenly aware that this almost felt a little bit like when you engage in participatory design efforts that aren't really focused on epistemic justice and are really just there for theater.
Yeah.
There was some of that, yeah. Anyway.
Surreptitious nature.
Yeah.
Before
just-
before you do that, can I stop sharing the screen? Or do you still want that?
Yeah. No, you can.
You stop?
Yeah.
Stop, okay.
Do we have any pictures from the event?
Yeah, we can show that as well.
May I respond? May I respond? Or
Yeah.
are we still in the, just very quickly?
Yeah.
I totally understand that it's a service someone does for someone else. This is why it's so important to emphasize the volunteer aspect.
Mhm.
And we had that in the big session where no one was forced
Yeah.
to volunteer.
Yeah.
And I made that very explicit, and that was super important. And we actually had observers who chose not to,
Up to
or
one.
some
Yeah.
didn't volunteer for a long time, and then because we worked in layers to
Came in
reduce
and out.
came in and out also. So there's a great, if I may say so, there was a certain ease about this. So no one was forced or so. But it is a service. It is a service, but you know, it's reciprocal. So you can it's a reciprocity. You can also work for someone and then be a client and then being representative. So this is part of this. Yes.
And I should say too, I wasn't making a critique of the work itself, just maybe talking about the challenge of doing the exact model that we did with the group over the course of the semester to give 15 people the attempt to be constellator, to be focus, to be various representors would take a whole semester. To do this in
It's a
and this
comprehensive
would be,
methodology.
this would be a very
This was a glimpse, and this was also what we did in a class yesterday with this very brief, what we also did as an introduction, where it's a very great, simple beginning, like a game, where you have 4 volunteers and there's no personal content, just one decides to be the client, and the other 3 are representors.
I had the benefit of that early on in our discussions and conversations and demonstrations of it. And I felt like Jen as well, that, oh, with this, I'm getting a taste of something here. It's extremely intriguing. And I felt benefited immediately, just as a representative, in looking at something that carefully and sensitively, called perception, which we all take advantage of, kind of unscrupulously, without thinking about it, and move so directly into conceptual work before we spent time or prolonging perceptual work. And I think that's something where the question fascinating me is, to what extent will the sentient designers in the world be able to develop their perceptual capacity to deal with the onslaught of AI, for example, into the practice. And what's left for designers to do this? And it will become, I think, strategic.
Abductive.
Yeah.
Show me AI that can do abductive thinking, and then we'll have a conversation.
Yeah.
Then that's our world.
Anyway, so
well, and you know, to kind of come back to this model, it has a very nice oracular quality. You know, you can go up to once this thing is constellated, you can go up to it, you can ask it questions, and it will give you some responses that may be actionable everywhere on the range from actionable to poetic, you know, and it's you know, as the constellator, your job is like sense making through this you know, and kind of feeling around the corners of this model to discover what's underneath latent in the system. So, you know, it becomes a kind of sense making activity, which I think is very valuable in design education, and an opportunity for working through these complex systems in ways that create this kind of knowledge that is not, you know, it's not, we're having the discussion, one of the students was here today and asked the question about replicability of the work yesterday, but maybe doesn't come out of scientific paradigms, but comes out of other paradigms that offer a different kind of insight. And,
more in the creative domains.
and complex systems thinking, chaotic systems thinking.
So I want to move to Greg quickly to talk about this question. Greg occupies a role, has occupied a role in a number of design organizations, design services organizations, and at different scales. He's now finds himself embedded in maybe one of the largest design firms on earth. I'm not sure if I say it right now. It's up in the 100,000. So that's large for a design practice, which typically over the last 100 years was a couple of people who had good conversations with each other. So, you know, the same question is, do you see something that can be embedded or integrated into contemporary design practice? At what scale or what?
I do. I think, you know, just getting familiar with how the whole thing works, right? So I've had the pleasure of kind of hearing about this from Nathan over coffees over time. And I think it's this method, what it sounds like and what it looks like and what it feels like are all, in my experience, significantly different, right? So hearing about it, then being a part of it, then I did actually take the liberty of stepping out of my position and looking at things from different angles yesterday, just to try to, or I'm sorry, Wednesday, just to try to get that other dimension of understanding. But to take a couple of phrases from your opening, Nathan, I think to get inside the system and to develop a shared vision, I think that's what I spend a lot of time doing in my role the last few years, trying to develop and maintain however robust of a shared vision we can between the design team and the client, who's typically working in sort of a business-centric environment, right? So there's some conflict or friction there in terms of we might get, conflict. We might have, you know, pressures to, you know, get things going really fast and get them done by a certain time. And there's all this influence from the business environment, right? So I think a lot of times what happens is we just get going. And then we have an approach and we're getting feedback and we're trying to develop that shared vision in the middle of it, right? Which is, sometimes it can work and sometimes people are good at working in that way. And sometimes that can be a real challenge. But I can see an opportunity here to say, all right, we have a situation. I won't say problem, but I'll say situation, whatever the thing is that we're all sort of focusing on. And if we did some constellating to get to a shared vision, then we have more alignment on the work at hand, and we might be working much smoother and more effectively coming out of that, right? I think some of the challenges in a typical client environment, when I start to think about, you know, the work that I do, as Jen mentioned, if we just rolled the tape on this conversation, most of the people we work with would be like, I don't know what you guys are talking about. But I think there's a way to develop trust and work someone up to the ability to do a multi-hour type exercise, right? So as Marcus mentioned, there was a game in the beginning, or there were some games in the beginning. They were short form. They sort of, and I won't try to, you know, explain it all. Hopefully you'll get to it later, but they were short form and they brought forth what I think is the difference between reading something or listening something and feeling something. The feeling of the dynamics when you're in a room with other people and you're moving around is something that I think the great power of this, you know, and I'm still not exactly sure I would apply in the client situations, but it could through iterations or adaptations. I think the great power of it would be that in a short amount of time, you could give someone a very deep kind of gut feeling of around certain connections or attributes of what you're working on. And that it would take hold a lot quicker than you reading it and being around it. What could take months could happen in an interaction that just left you with sort of a very, I use the word like internalized, like a very internalized understanding of something that's beyond you just reading about it or observing it. So a couple of things that came to mind, because that's my general take on what it would be. I think it's developing that trust, maybe through smaller exercises, having people then with that trust participate more freely in longer form ones. And then the other thing, I'll put these questions out there and then we should talk more broadly. There was a period of time where journey maps were really big. They were happening all over the place, right? And there a lot of work went into them. I was a part of teams, that did really, I think, amazing stuff. The uptake on them was always a bit of a coin flip. You know, how is it going to get utilized inside the organization? So I wonder, is this a supplement to maps? Could this replace maps? Like, is it even in the same category? So I'm kind of looking at Jen for that. And then the other one that I'll put out there, and I don't know, we can take these in one order or another, but I still don't have a tight answer on. I wrote this down on Wednesday. What is the function of the physical arrangement?
Yeah.
But how would you describe what the function of physically arranging everyone is? I have my own idea, but I may be curious to hear from Marcus, how you would describe that.
I'm not sure if I understand the question. What is the function of the physical arrangement?
Of having the constellator actually placing people physically.
Yeah,
You don't go in before and say, all right, here are the marks on the floor, everybody stand in the mark. You're
Yeah.
actually moving somebody.
right.
I want to hear Marcus's answer and then I want
Okay,
to
yeah,
tell you what I experienced,
Okay.
because it was not what I expected.
I'll try to give a few, points of view on this. So first of all, this happens intuitively. That's key. That's no one, not even the client modeler, can look behind their own intuition. Do you remember the soil position?
Yeah.
Which was, and I was surprised that you addressed it afterwards like this, and you said you had no idea that it would end up there.
Yeah.
Yeah, just to clarify, there was one entity in the constellation that represented, I think in conversation with Marcus, I had said, fertile soil, protected spaces for innovative thinking, kind of like a mishmash of an abstract idea. And it was an entity I wanted represented in the constellation. We used the abbreviation soil. So again, the representative doesn't know what that is. And when that person who volunteered to play the representative for soil volunteered, by that point in the process, I was completely out of the intellectualized space and letting my intuition place the representers, and I essentially, yes, it was Grisha, and then it was amazing. But once she was there in front of me to be placed, I didn't know why, but I put her in a place that I would not have anticipated, not a place that I would have put if I was drawing the map on my desk. But my gut said, this representer goes here, and then that of course illuminated things downstream. So yes.
And by the way, this was an aspect. So we address what representors represent as aspects. It's also a Wittgensteinian term, but we can go into this later or some other time. And only the client, and this was a process of getting to this name for this aspect. So this was the result of resource inquiry from my side. I was looking for resources. And why do we need resources? Because if we only have problem aspects, we get a pretty static representation of what the problem is or the problematic system. And then nothing may happen. This is very important why this is embedded in the solution-focused process. And so it gives you a form of teleonomy. And it's not so much the goal, again, it is that it's the pull, it's the drift, it's the current we need. This is all we need, yeah? And dynamic, to say dynamic is already too concrete. It is a little something else. Okay, so it's intuition. We need the client modeler's intuition. That is, we cannot go behind this. Another thing is to become more concrete is that we are using, I think this is me talking now, over many years trying to make sense of what modeling actually means. And modeling is one of the big central questions now in foundational research still, and it's absolutely fascinating. I think we are using the physical space as a domain of where classical information can take place. You could, if I relate it to the term screen, like we have a big screen here, it's a little confusing because it's a space and there are people standing there. So it's, in a metaphorical way, you could say it's a screen. Because what is actually happening, I think, is that the client modeler's internal model and what is actually constellated in the physical space, this difference or discrepancy, something is happening there. This is my assumption at the moment. This is also where my research, where my research interest lies at the moment. Because at some point I thought, well, if the internal model is topological, which means it's a geometry which is not three-dimensional, It is very open. We could go as far as to say it's fractal because we work with so many different layers and scales and areas on the scale and references over large scale sometimes, and resources can be minute or they can be from somewhere else. So there is a certain fractality in there. But if you look at the model and how it could be internally, thought of or depicted, it's a topology. I did this work at the Cybernetics conference 10 years ago with famous topologist Luke Kaufman, who is a not theoretician. And because I had the hunch back then that what we're doing here, or what the client modeler is doing, is threading like a net of sorts, where it's relevant whether one thread goes over or under the other. And of course, the semiotics for this would be outrageous to develop because it's also situational. It all changes, of course, but the analogy is there, And he could make sense of that. And so we had a wonderful session at the end of that conference. And so I would say something is happening between the inner topology of the model and the externalization into a classical information space. And this is what I'll say for the moment. There's more to be said. Maybe I'll say it right away, because the question is, and what hasn't been mentioned as much so far is this central phenomenon, a representational perception and what it may be. And research needs to go into this. The SÜST Institute founders, Varga and Spara, they developed over the decades, a reference which they call transverbality, transverbal language. They say, well, what we're doing here is one form of transverbal language, which is a wonderful metaphor and a wonderful concept. It hasn't been fully worked out. So someone ought to do that. I won't do it, but and there's a lot of reference here and there, but it needs to be made a program. What is the challenge? The challenge is very basically to say, there's this famous Bar Hillel, Yehoshua Bar Hillel, philosopher, mathematician hierarchy of language, where you would start with this is what you learn in school, and you would start with semiotics and syntax and semantics and pragmatics. And then it takes Matthias Varga, who is a logician, who says, well, below, under semiotics, you have semiosis. It's how the signs come into being. And this is already very mysterious, because how signs come into being have a lot to do with the top, with the pragmatics, how we engage, how we do these kind of heuristics. And this methodology is a heuristic so far. And this is how it is practiced and offered. But signs come into being through, all kinds of different, also systemic processes. It's not always like we know what signs we're creating. Otherwise, we wouldn't have these, puzzles. And so this is quite fascinating to have. Are we still online?
Seems to be.
Yes, yeah, okay.
Yep.
Someone
can still see
needs to,
Great. Okay.
it's the update thing, just like exit out of the little update pop-up window.
Okay.
Go back to,
I'll just continue. So
yeah, it's funny, click cancel. Don't exit out of.
we're back.
Don't leave.
Don't leave, we're here.
Out of the moon shadow. Okay. So you have this famous linguistic hierarchy, and this would be like, this is the language, how we can deal with language or formalize in a certain way. Language plus, and I'm making it a little short and little condensed here. So we would have this concept of language, this explanation, structural explanation of language, plus representational perception, and both of those would make up for the transverbal language, for this generalized term. So it's basically all which we know. Verbal language, yes, verbal language. Part of pragmatics is also non-verbal language, and this is also distinguished into There's pantomime, you know, which is very direct, demonstrative, non-verbal language, but then you have also social signs, which only groups know, you know. So non-verbality is also part of it, very important, plus this representational perception. So you see how I'm trying to, within minutes, try to explain transverbality, which is a bit of a challenge. And part of my reasoning around this to also have maybe a different kind of approach to this phenomenon. And there seems to be maybe a way to based on current foundational research, how this representational perception, how it has been addressed so far, which is still fine. This may become enriched by other terminology in the future, and this is something I'm working on or interested in. You know, just also to have a democratic view on this, so that also this methodology is not only bound or prefaced or headlined by transverbality, which is wonderful. It's very good. But I think what's always missing also is the scientific approach to the phenomenon. And this also this opened over the decades, opened the way also to a lot of esoteric pseudoscientific nonsense in terms of quantum esoterics and all of this, which are nightmare and which make it only more difficult to explain this and also to say what it actually is we're doing here. Yeah, so it's not only a methodology. There's much more going on underneath it with modeling and all these kinds of things. So we need this to bring it back into the workspace. We need the classical information domain. And why? Because we still have to talk about it. I still have to say to my client, what would be the next position? What would be, yeah, when we work in there? So we still are bound to language, and that's the classical information domain. Even though we seem to be working at the core of it, and that's just another way of saying representational perception with entanglement, with an entanglement effect.
Stole the word I was about to say in my response. I was like, right there. That's what it is in a nutshell. Yeah. I mean, and also to add on to that and also come back to your first question, I can link the two, because everything Marcus just said is like exactly how I experienced it, but I didn't necessarily anticipate it. And I didn't know anything to anticipate. But I think what's so key is that if prior to this, you would ask me, again, as a systems thinker, blah, 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 to draw this map, or, you know, to your point, to think about these positions and then just come in and put you all there. Could we still have gotten some value out of this? Absolutely, because you're still just hearing people describe, you know, their perception from their representer spot, sure. But I made a point not to do the intellectual cerebral activity of making a map, because this is more than just, hi, I made an ecosystem map and now each symbol in my map is talking to me. It's much more than that. It was truly the physical, embodied, intuitive experience. And it wasn't just me placing. But as soon as I was, and I'm not really a person who like, because I'm touching someone's shoulders and gently moving them into position, it isn't really the touch or anything woo-woo about that, but truly I'm moving Anne's body into a new position. And there's even an entanglement in the sense that where do I stop and where does Anne begin? Where do I stop and the whole constellation begin? That question can't be answered. I mean, the more I think about it and I try to pull it apart, it's like one of those little kids' toys, the little finger trap toys, where if you pull apart, you get stuck even more. So to try to extract kind of reinforces the polarity. So long story short, it was absolutely, there is a difference, and there's not to say that it wouldn't be valuable for me to go and map this visually later. Sure, why not? It becomes a snapshot, a memory tool. But to intellectually map, which I do all the time, journey maps, other maps, etc., and to physically constellate is like the difference between looking at a two-dimensional map and either a three-dimensional globe or a four-dimensional brain-exploding thing. So it's just one is a projection, a flattened projection of the others, and so that's to me the difference. I'll come to the journey.
Well, quickly, just to stay on the toy references, at one point I remember you talking about a Ouija board
Yeah.
in the exercise.
Yeah.
And there is an element of that in it.
It
where
is.
It's like, who's moving it? Am I moving or are you moving? Like, you know, and so it's almost sounding like it's a possibility of bringing out your intuition and then getting to look at it.
Exactly right. I've never, I mean, I shouldn't say never, but I've never done it in this kind of context, had that experience where from a professional designerly place, gotten to look at myself That constellation is an extension of me as a designer. And and of course that makes sense given the origins and the history and the legacy of this kind of a method, right? So naturally, even though we're not talking about a therapeutic or clinical therapeutic kind of approach, of course, there's still a level of like, there was a mirror in that room. That was sort of like the metaphor, and it was not, like I said, I didn't have an anticipation of anything, but that was something I wouldn't have expected. But to come back around now to the fact that I think sense making is the key word, like I'm with you, right? So, I'm a designer. Am I a journey map factory? Sometimes. Do I make personas and archetypes and the service blueprints? I think in our world, so coming now from like back to theory, back to practice, so many folks, clients in particular, confuse artifacts, outputs, outcomes, etc. They just confuse all of these terms. And so, is this something that can become complementary to or replace or etc.? I mean, the answer is yes and to all of that. I think, and I have found this to be true with other common methods or artifacts. Think about journey mapping. Journey mapping can be a sense-making activity, but the journey map can also be, you could argue whether it's useful in this way, the output. Journey mapping as a sense-making activity, journey mapping as a decision-making or, kind of alignment activity, these are all different. So this process to me strikes me as one that as a sense-making activity, highly valuable, especially for the people, whether they are designers by title or just designers by virtue of the task they're involved in, everyday Joe Schmo, lowly non-designers, right? Like whenever we think about them, the act of engaging in this is sense making, so that if you were using journey maps or other methods for sense making, I think they're very complementary. And I think there are a lot of mapping techniques, collaborative, physical, embodied in-person techniques that this kind of merges really nicely with, that I could easily see. But again, to your point, with a pretty good investment of the time, the preparation, the trust building to get to that place. I can ask some clients to take a leap of faith with me and engage in something like this. I can't ask others. There would be a much more of an on-ramp. But I think at the end of the day, the potential is definitely there for this to be complementary among sense-making activities if the folks who are involved are willing to let it be that. You have to let it be sense-making and not try to force it to become. You'll notice nothing in the constellation or any of these was focused on the apps that people are using. It wasn't about an app or a tool or a device. It wasn't about wayfinding in a hospital. It wasn't about designing a benefits grid on a health insurance website. That was not part of this. Now, can any of that, flow downstream from some of the sense making and the decisions that happen? Maybe, but I had to let it not be about the designerly convergence of those things.
Yeah, I think when you said convergence earlier about the journey map with the convergence, then the other journey map is contingent and critical. So moving away from the convergence and deterministic top-down, you call it, approach, that means you have to shed some of that, let go of some of that, and move into a world which is increasingly contingent. So you have a tool maybe more appropriate for these times in this approach. I had a little episode of testing a little bit, what I thought was sort of my own tool that I had constructed out of what I've learned so far with some students in the fall. And the first provocation produced designers doing what designers think they should be doing and making gadgets. And I halted that, and we conducted a little Constellation Light session in which they took on these aspects. Following that session, the whole discourse turned into a discussion of the flow of information within the community of interest. That was such a huge transformation of what the people in the room thought they were supposed to be thinking about, and the sort of way they're using their mind. So that resonated.
I'm wondering how much of this work that is done through this method is dependent upon this kind of ambiguity and uncertainty, maybe even separation from like something that's so direct with map making. I think with map making, you have like a lot of tightly related symbols that are, connected to a concept or and here, we're backing off to a looseness in representation where TL3, what is that thing? Nobody's quite sure. And we're really like trying to get beneath these representations to a level of engagement with the concepts and the relationships that is maybe formative in a different way.
Yeah, I'll formative form. I'm picking up form. We are working, and I've mentioned this before. We're working with structures. We're not in a strict sense. We're not working on systems. The effects may take place within systems, but what client is working on is the structure of something. And whatever form we are presented with, either in the client problem setting or then in the process, is just possibilities of structure. And this is Wittgenstein again, I apologize. So this is what we're maneuvering, so to speak. And we as the client is doing that, and in the preliminary, in the preceding conversation, we're trying to get to that. Yes.
Yeah, but
Yes.
even like, well, Simon would be like, yeah, you can't do this, you know, these representers are all at different levels of the system. You know, we need to flatten this out so, you know, we don't have dilemmas or trilemmas, tetralemmas mapped at the same level of abstraction as the patient and their body, right?
Yes.
Because these are concepts that are foreign to one another. They
Just to clarify the jargon for anyone listening, if you have a dilemma, you already have a tetralemma. It's an ancient concept. It just says that if there is a polarity, you always have forms of both and forms of neither. And for the logicians, Varga went as far to have 40 boths by now, and forms of neither is just an exploration then to make it specific in a certain case. Why did we use this canonical format as basic format here? Because there was such a strong polarity in the core problem setting between measurement and target that lent itself to using the tetralemma. Of course, this was just I didn't say to my client, "Oh, let's do a tetralemma." But it was a process of finding out whether this would make sense. Yeah, it was emergent as well. So this also is not something you take like an idea from the outside, because then I would just do the same mistake of interpreting something prematurely. But this polarity lent it, and then what was important was to have so we would have the measurement, which had a different name than in the practical, in the actual constellation, which was only changed in the last seconds before you did it, because it made more sense.
Yeah.
And this is what.
Yeah, we didn't label it as measurement in the constellation.
Yes.
We labeled it as thermometer.
Yeah.
Because that's where my, you know.
Yeah, that's
intuitive.
and this is what you ask then as a facilitator. Is that the right name? And could it have because sometimes it's very helpful. So that those two positions got the name and the place. And the other ones would TL3, TL4, and TL5 were only what we call syntactical positions. Again, if you have a dilemma, you already have the other positions. In TL5, we could go into this, go into the literature. We also have the former representer of TL5. Very good, very good. So basically, you can describe a tetralemma as a sequence of negations. So 2 negates 1, 3 negates the former, 4 negates the former, and then you can do another negation move, and that's an invention or discovery by Matthias Varga as a logician, based on these ancient concepts, which helps to be creative. So TL5 is also something which, in this specific case, which only gets an impulse by the client modeler, and then may move around freely, carefully and freely, and that turns out often to be very, very helpful.
I think your point about different levels of abstraction is a really good one to highlight, especially for folks who are listening or didn't attend on Wednesday and are still probably, this is all very fuzzy to even imagine what unfolded. You know, we literally, the constellator, placed the representer of measurement here and the representer of target here, because there is that dilemma. And then you've got a representer who represents what would be both measurement and target simultaneously, and then one that represented neither. They didn't know that's what they represented at all. And yet watching some of the conversation unfold about what I'm seeing or what I'm feeling as I stand here was very illuminating for me. But it does strike me that having one representer represent the concept of both measurement and target, and having somebody else represent body, physical body in the health system, these are very different types of notions. And it's a little, to me, I'm a metaphor person. It's a lot like when you think about Google Maps and you're looking at a Google map, you can look at different layers. I don't like the word here, but like the layers you can turn on and off in Google Maps, right? You can be looking at the literal terrain. You can be looking at maybe more of a topographical, et cetera, type of map. You can be looking at the traffic. You can be looking at, so almost in a way, this constellation is turning on all the layers at once and seeing how they interact with each other through that mesh or through that grid in like the fourth dimension, which again, we're getting strangely abstract. But I'll say one other quick thing to help make this somewhat concrete. And I remember saying this to these guys on Wednesday afternoon. It also strikes me that if you think about, and this comes to the question about using this in alignment, with a client, and people seeing shared vision, alignment versus coherence is a very, very big idea. And I don't think the goal for me as a designer in practice, and probably for many, is truly alignment. Do you really want every single person looking the same direction? I often think of maps of magnetic fields or maps of wind. If you ever are familiar with these visuals, you see lots of little arrows. It's just here's the map, and then this little arrows pointing different directions to show you which way the magnetism's pulling or which way the wind is blowing and how long of an arrow. You don't really want, as a designer, to have every single aspect or entity in a system all pointing the same direction. That doesn't tell you anything. It doesn't give you anything dynamic. Doesn't allow for invention of any kind, really. You want coherence, which simply means that what they're doing is making sense to you, or that you can work with it. So if you think about a magnetic field with all these little arrows pointing different ways, that's invisible. But I, as a person, could figure out where those arrows are by putting a compass at each location. And this activity of constellating felt to me like I was looking at, the room was an invisible magnetic field, but each person as a representer was showing me which way their compass pointed, which kind of told me which way the magnetic field was going. And that in turn for me gave me some designerly insight, even if I couldn't articulate it explicitly. All right.
The abstraction, I think, is, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, could you talk about that part at the end where you switched process? Because I don't think you. Okay, go ahead, Greg.
Yes, the last thing I would say, your question, I think the abstraction is like one of the most important, but the most tricky parts of it. And the importance, I think, comes from, back to my question about the maps. When you say map, I think some people can view it as a reference document, like we're gonna take it and go on a tour of sites in downtown Boston, we're gonna look at the map and go back to what we're doing, versus what I think we're trying to give or deliver with a map is a more robust understanding that somebody can just hold within them and then operate from there, not to have to go back to the map as a reference. So this exercise, right, because you don't have all these definitions and it doesn't get treated like a reference document, I think has the ability to get you to that deeper understanding quicker or more completely.
I almost wanted to vaporize, evaporate.
Yeah, it doesn't get caught on the language and words. There's no Velcro to hook on and get stuck.
We should probably open it up for the public, I think, because some people are starting to be on time. So I know we can go over, but and do you wanna elaborate a bit more on your question?
I got the
You
question.
got it? Okay.
Yes, so there's a certain sequence in doing a SYST, and since this was a model, an initial model, which you took on quite substantial stakeholders, so to speak, and entities and aspects. So it was already revealing what as you described. What came out of the first picture of the constellation, as we would call them. As soon as there is from representors, and I remember that, and then again, all of the former representors will de-roll and unrepresent again, because they're always, whenever we make reference, they're pulled in back again a little bit, and we don't want that. We want the whole person after this to live freely. Whenever, from a representor's point of view, there comes an offer, like I have an impulse of going over there or doing this or taking this person by the hand. This is an introduction. This is an offer of going into process work. So it all, again, it never comes from anywhere else than from the picture, from the model itself. And when that happens, and then it happened on a few places, then you go into process work. That's the quick answer. Yeah.
And
What is
emerges
process
again.
work?
Oh, what is process work? Process work is literally beginning to change or then eventually changing the problem picture. And sometimes it can be a vast difference between the initial picture and what is called in the literature the solution picture. It all depends on the problem set. In this case, there was already so much happening. It was a behemoth on aspects and energies right there, yeah. And so the small change was already a lot. And if you remember that this moving also really also led to very strong distinctions and differentiations and notions and perceptions. And that's a sign, first of all, methodologically, that's a very important sign to really to be careful and also to remind everyone to move carefully within a constellated picture. That's absolutely important. Even with test actions, even if someone is trying something out, because the senses are so heightened, it can be very heightened. And also the free element, for instance, the fifth non-position in the tetralemma, so to speak, it's always instructed to move slowly and responsibly. Yeah. And this is a crucial thing. So this is a crucial thing also for introducing it. This is why I was so extra careful to first teach, literally teach there, to first teach how to step out of a representation before anyone ever stepped into a representation. And also to make sure that no one has to endure anything. Because of course, in the preparation, I thought, well, it's a new place, it's new representatives, what could be, and then we very likely will have one aspect, one representation named patient and body in a very contentious setting. What could happen? And so that was important to make sure that everyone, and then it turned out puzzlingly that the patients already had given up in a sense. At that moment, they were
going
reduced,
away from the whole thing.
going
Yeah,
away.
going away.
Then we had, yeah. And so, yes.
And Michael said, I think we lost them.
Yes,
It's like
yes.
Losing a patient.
Yeah.
Yeah, and when we were joking about people who were in the representative roles would see that, like, you know, they would do something or people would unconsciously be stepping or moving away from the people near them. Marcus and I would be laughing or not laughing in a ha-ha way, but just like, oh my gosh, that's so interesting because they don't know who they represent. And yet we had placed patient and body back to back and they did, after a while, they didn't want to be like that. They wanted to feel, you know, they wanted to be facing the rest of and
Yes.
part of the rest of the constellation.
This is important to take seriously and to take as an offer. And this is why we then also said, what would your impulse be? And give into this for a moment, test it. And then you said, could we turn it back because I want to see an earlier stage, and then you can do that also. So you can also carefully move back on a timeline if it's useful. If it's
This is strikes me as the opposite of brainstorming, the opposite of post-it notes or wishful thinking, wild guessing.
that's all good. That's
Yeah.
all good. It's all useful.
This is very different. This is very different.
Are there any other questions, either online or here in the room? There are a few groups about if it's possible to share all this literature and references that you gave, that we can send it to you. So we will do that for those who ask online. But any other questions, thoughts?
I was thinking about Grisha's role, who has a very embodied practice. I felt like she was trying to bring additional or question whether additional variables could play a role in this or should. So we didn't really address it in that. I'm just curious about
In terms of research and experiments, I'm super open to that. It would be super intriguing. Risha was so kind to even in the first little demo, just constellation where we only demonstrated what representational perception is. She already had the idea of moving within the axis. And of course, this can be explored. I mean, it has happened. It has happened in the past. Matthias's favorite anecdote is he worked with a priest, and some of the representors always wanted to go. I think it was also tetralemma, but that's coincidence right now. I think the fifth position in this, they always wanted to go upstairs. And then he realized, or they realized at some point, that there were some earthly concerns in his problem setting and some heavenly. And this is why people always who would have thought? That's what they found out. Now, is this in every case the case? No, I would say no, but this is what can happen, of course. So it's part of, but I'm very interested in all these other forms, and of course, yeah, this needs to be investigated.
There is one question. Would it be possible to compare this with brainstorming, actually?
Yeah, I just did. It seems the opposite. I mean, because it's extremely sensitive. I think brainstorming is okay. We've got a room full of people here. What are your thoughts? And people start, and they bring in the styrofoam bats and make it fun and just collect the room, collecting things and then trying to put them on a map.
I think
So it seems the opposite.
Sorry, yes. There's a wonderful anecdote. I'm sorry to interrupt,
No,
but there's this famous technique by David Bohm, which is called the dialogue. David Bohm was a very famous physicist in Princeton. And he and one of his best friends was a sage, an Indian sage by the name of Krishnamurti. And you will find on YouTube these fantastic dialogues shot by the BBC in the 70s in a library somewhere in Princeton or wherever it was. And they were practicing the dialogue. But the practice of the dialogue was that these two extremely distinguished gentlemen would sit opposite each other in silence, trying to wait for what they actually could talk about. So I think it has more to do with that than with brainstorming.
Well, it also strikes me that the brainstorming also uses language, which designers use repeatedly and blindly in ways that I think create misunderstanding more than understanding. And I think the other thing I would contrast brainstorming, which seems unrooted, with this, which has a topology which must be protected and is extremely precarious and sensitive work. I mean, this sensitive, that's what's taxing about it conceptually. It requires a rigor that I think is seldom employed in most design processes. And that's what more than intrigues me about it. I think there's huge value in this, especially going forward as designers in a world as precarious as ours. They would be extremely sensitive and careful and humble with regard to what we think we're doing, and moving from this heroic savior mold into you're entering into something in which you have no expertise. It resides in the client. They're building something within which people will work to their benefit rather than something shipped to them. It's a move from designing for to designing with to designing within. So within and everyone moving within a way together. And to the extent you can, but the disruptive, innovative technology approach has not gotten us in good places.
Well, the other kind of important contrast, I think, with brainstorming is that there's sort of like a frictionless affirmation that happens in brainstorming. Every idea is a great idea, and thank you for that idea, and like, let's have some more. And this has really been found, in when you get back to research and creative idea generation, to be actually a very poor method for getting to creative leaps in this. And what's really valuable is the friction and the resistance that comes with this technique.
I think that thinking about this by the phrase solution oriented or solution focused can be almost a bit confusing, because the way when Marcus says that phrase in reference to this type of thinking, it's almost counterintuitive. It's not the goal of this, and for me, like, this wasn't about ideas. It wasn't about generating ideas, but ideas emerge. But the ideas are making themselves known. I'm not a designer pulling them out of thin air or out of the ground. I'm not like harvesting carrots out of the soil. And it occurs to me, rhizomes as a metaphor, very big these days in the designerly world, whether you're thinking about them from the design perspective or whether you're, you know, the Wheaties fan or whatever it might be. But this type of work sort of strikes me as the closest thing to something that truly digs at a rhizome or rhizomic, or however you'd like to think about it, in the soil, underneath the soil, really thinking about what it means to think about assemblages and rhizomes. Yes, something emerges on the surface, a mushroom pops up, a tree pops up, there's your ideas, there's your brainstorming, there's your quote solutions in the design sense. But this is allowing us to actually get down into the roots, and not tree tap roots that are very hierarchical, but webs of rhizome type of roots.
And that's the flow.
Exactly.
We're getting into the flow of information in a kind of a, I won't say pure sense, but in a classical sense of information flow. Looking for the differences that make a difference, therefore the distinctions and the indications that go with them. And we're really following G. Spencer Brown again and saying, this is about learning how to bear something in mind, in which in case he would say, not thinking, not talking, not working, to bear in mind that which it is to be known. So we're looking for the yet unknown, the unforeseen, the lost, the missing, rather than the usual stuff that we bring into that kind of discussion.
Yeah.
Well, you have a question? Yeah, one last question.
I'm just wondering, like, in the research or looking at the process as well, like, did you look into how it could be applied specifically for like pretty intense conflict resolution? Like, I come from kind of a poli-sci background, so I was just thinking about how much of this could be applied there.
Marshall Rosenberg.
If you found.
Yeah, Rosenberg is one of the main inspirations also. I should have mentioned him as well.
Okay.
But there are others, there's so many others. Yeah, they were good friends with him. The developers of this were good friends. Yeah, yes. So nonviolent communication is deeply embedded in this. Yes. Yeah, we're thinking too rhizomatic. I mean, this is just me talking now, but it's always a little bit. So what if responsibilities is part of the problem, and then you say, oh, it's all just you know, it's a little bit there, a little bit. Yeah, you have to condense it at some moment, but still work safely with it. Yeah, and not accuse anyone, because that yeah. So this is it's a navigational method, which is
it's beyond seeing and hearing, and even beyond feeling to sensing. And I think that's closer to where you would like to see perception understood.
Yes.
As sensing.
Yeah.
And that what it senses is something that's not burdened.
Yes.
So it's unburdening the process of thinking. It's like, so the other day, it's like we heard about design thinking. Designers just call it thinking, but that's tends to focus on the brain. And we're not talking about that. We're talking about the designer's mind, what goes on in the mind of a designer or a client as they're working in this way to understand something, not resolve.
Similar to that, the later Wittgenstein worked out that there is no, so in his private language argument, that there is no such thing as a private language. We could take that as an idea and say there is no such thing as a private perception.
Yeah,
it's something like that. But first and foremost, use it safely. And if I may come back to it, if you try this at home. If you tried in the classroom, I would firstly introduce what we did on Wednesday. First of all, learn how to step out of a representation. And it's a simple thing, you just step out of it, you say your own name. Sometimes they're more sticky, then there are even formats. There are SUSE formats where you can give back the role And again, we only in this, we don't use role, we just use aspect representation, but sometimes it becomes like a role for an actor, can also be sticky.
It's like
And then
learning to ride a bicycle, you want to learn how to stop first.
Exactly. And then you build it up safely, and that's it. And then it can be scaled, it can be completely scaled. And this is where I would start to introduce it, to use it simply as you already did, and then then go from there and use gentle,
Gradual,
small,
gentle,
gentle,
quiet.
and have canonical formats and custom made the models, you know, step by step.
Yeah.
And then it's
What
usable.
I was using a phrase that we first had that demo, but entering the true imaginary. I mean, we talk about being creative and using your imagination, whatever, in a kind of rapid way. In fact, there is kind of a true imaginary that you get to with this development of perception in a very, very careful way. I mean, we have sensitive apparatus
Right.
for sensing the universe, and we don't use it sensitively
Mhm.
or sensibly. I think that's something to look for.
Well, I realize we are a little bit over time, so thanks for staying with us. This is fascinating. Yes, it is being recorded and we'll share it online, so we'll share that information. Thank you very much. Thank you, Marcus, Jen, Michael, Greg, and Nathan, and everyone that participated.
And thank you, Estefania.
Thank you to the team. Thanks everyone online. Yes, thank you. Thank everyone. Thanks everyone.